Chapter 9 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Mary Ann. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 9, Appomattox. The Battle of Five Forks ought to have ended the war. Lee's right had been shattered and routed. His line, as he had long predicted, had been stretched westward until it broke. There was no longer any hope of saving Richmond, or even of materially delaying its fall. But General Lee apparently thought that even the gain of a day was of value to the Richmond government, and what was left of the Army of Northern Virginia was still so perfect in discipline and obedience that it answered with unabated spirit and courage every demand made upon it. It is painful to record, or to read, the story of the hard fighting of the 2nd of April. Every drop of blood spent on the lines of Petersburg that day seems to have been shed in vain. Parke and Wright had been ordered on the 30th of March to examine the enemy's works in their respective fronts, with a view to determine whether it was practicable to carry them by assault. They had both reported favorably. After the great victory of Five Forks, Grant, whose anxiety for Sheridan seems excessive, thought that Lee would reinforce against him heavily, when in fact Lee had already sent to his right all the troops that could be spared, and Sheridan had routed them. To relieve Sheridan and to take advantage of any weakness in Lee's extended front, Grant now ordered an assault all along the lines. The answers came in with electric swiftness and confidence. Wright said he would make the fur fly. Ord promised to go into the Confederate lines like a hot knife into butter. The ground, however, in front of Ord was so difficult that Grant gave him no positive orders to assault, but, on the contrary, enjoined upon him great vigilance and caution. Similar instructions were given to Humphreys. Miles, of his corps, was ordered westward on the White Oak Road to help Sheridan, and Wright and Parke were directed to attack at 4 o'clock on the morning of the 2nd. Grant's principal anxiety was lest Lee should get away from Petersburg and overwhelm Sheridan on the White Oak Road. Lee was thinking of nothing of the kind. The terrible blow his right had received seemed to have stunned him. He waited, with a fortitude not far from despair, for the attack which the morning was sure to bring, making what hasty preparations were in his power for the coming storm. It came with the first glimmer of dawn. Wright, who had carefully studied the ground in his front, from the safe point of vantage he had gained the day of Gordon's ill-fated sortie, had selected the open space in front of Forts Fisher and Walsh as the weak point in the Confederate harness. Not that it was really weak, except in comparison with the almost impregnable works to right and left. The enemy's front was intersected by marshy rivulets. A heavy abatis had to be cut away under musketry fire from the parapets and a rain of artillery from the batteries. It was 4:45 before there was light enough to guide the storming columns, but at that instant they swarmed forward, rushing over the Confederate pickets with too much momentum to be delayed a minute, and, gaining the main works, made them their own after a brief but murderous conflict. In 15 minutes Wright lost 1,100 men. They wasted not an instant after this immense success. Some pushed on in the ardor of the assault across the Boydton Road as far as the South Side Railroad. The gallant Confederate General A.P. Hill rode unawares upon a squad of these skirmishers, and, refusing to surrender, lost his life at their hands. But the main body of the troops wisely improved their victory. A portion of them worked resolutely to the right, meeting strong resistance from the Confederates under Wilcox. The larger part reformed with the celerity that comes from discipline and experience, and moved down the reverse of the captured lines to Hatcher's Run, where, about 7 o'clock, having swept everything before them and made large captures of men and guns, they met their comrades of the 24th Corps, whom they joined, facing about and marching over ground cleared of the enemy, till the left closed in on the Appomattox River. Parke also assaulted at the earliest light, meeting with a success on the outer line equally brilliant and important, capturing 400 yards of entrenchments with many guns, colors, and prisoners. But there was in front of him an interior line, heavily fortified, and here the enemy, under General Gordon, not only made a stand, but resumed the offensive and assaulted several times during the day, without success, the lines which Parke had seized in the morning and hastily reversed. On the left, Humphreys displayed his usual intelligent energy. As soon as he heard of the success of Wright and Parke on his right, he attacked with Hay's division the Confederate redoubt at Crow's House, capturing the works, the guns, and most of the garrison. while on his left Mott's division drove the enemy out of their works at Burgess's Mill. Humphreys wanted to concentrate his whole corps against the scattered enemy by the Clybourne road, but General Meade countermanded the movement. Mott and Hayes were ordered towards Petersburg, and Miles, who had been holding the White Oak Road for Sheridan, was therefore left alone to deal with Heth's division, which had hastily entrenched itself near Sunderland Station, and here a sharp fight took place. Miles, twice repulsed, stuck obstinately to his task, and about 3 o'clock whipped and dislodged the enemy, making large captures and driving him off towards the Appomattox and Amelia Courthouse. 2 forts, Gregg and Whitworth, on the main line of the Confederate entrenchments west of Petersburg, made a stout resistance to the National troops. The former was a very strong work, surrounded by a deep and wide, wet ditch, flanked by fire to the right and left. It was an ugly thing to handle, but Robert S. Foster's and J. W. Turner's divisions of Gibbon's corps assaulted with unflinching valor, meeting a desperate resistance. Every advantage, except that of numbers, was on the side of its brave defenders, and they put twice their own numbers hors de combat before they surrendered. Gibbon reports a loss of 714 killed and wounded. 55 Confederate dead were found in the work. After Gregg had fallen, Turner's men made short work of Fort Whitworth, and the Confederates, from the Appomattox to the Weldon Road, fell slowly back to their inner line of works near Petersburg, now garrisoned by Longstreet's troops, who had come in from the north side of the James. The attack of Wright, though it must have been anticipated, came upon General Lee with the stunning effect of lightning. Before the advance of the National Army had been reported to Lee or A. P. Hill, they saw squads of men in blue scattered about the Boyton Road, and it was in riding forward to ascertain what the strange apparition meant that General Hill lost his life. General Lee, in full uniform, with his dress sword, which he seldom wore, but which he had put on that morning in honor of the momentous day he saw coming, being determined with that chivalrous spirit of his to receive adversity splendidly, watched from the lawn in front of his headquarters the formidable advance of the National troops before whom his weakened lines were breaking into spray, and then, mounting his iron gray charger, slowly rode back to his inner line. There his ragged troops received him with shouts and cheers, which showed there was plenty of fight left in them, and there he spent the day in making preparations for the evacuation which was now the only resort left him. He sent a dispatch to Richmond, carrying in brief and simple words the message of despair to the Confederate authorities. I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here till night. I am not certain I can do that. He succinctly stated the disaster that had befallen him, announced his purpose of concentrating on the Danville road, and advised that all preparations be made for leaving Richmond that night. Some Confederate writers expressed surprise that General Grant did not attack and destroy Lee's army on the afternoon of the 2nd of April, but this is a view, after the fact, easy to express. Wright's and Humphreys' troops on the Union left had been on foot for 18 hours. They had fought an important battle, marched and countermarched many miles, and were now confronted by Longstreet's fresh corps, behind formidable works, led by the best of Lee's generals, while the attitude of the force under Gordon, on the south side of the town, was such as to require the close attention of Parke. Grant, anticipating an early retirement of Lee from his citadel, wisely resolved to avoid the waste and bloodshed of an immediate assault on the inner lines at Petersburg. He ordered Sheridan to get upon Lee's line of retreat, sent Humphreys to strengthen him, then, directing a general bombardment for 5 o'clock the next morning, and an assault at 6, he gave himself and his soldiers a little of the rest they had so richly earned, and which they so seriously needed, as a restorative after the labors past, and a preparation for the labors to come. He had telegraphed during the day to President Lincoln, who was at City Point, the great day's news as it developed hour by hour. He was particularly happy at the large captures. How many prisoners was always the first question as an aide-de-camp came galloping in with news of success. Prisoners he regarded as so much net gain. He was weary of slaughter. He wanted the war ended with the least bloodshed possible. It was with the greatest delight that he was able to telegraph on this Sunday afternoon, "The whole captures since the army started out gunning will not amount to less than 12,000 men and probably 50 pieces of artillery." General Lee, after the first shock of the breaking of his lines, soon recovered his usual sang-froid, and bent all his energies to saving his army and leading it out of its untenable position on the James to a point from which he could effect a junction with Johnston in North Carolina. The place selected for this purpose was Burkesville, at the crossing of the South Side and Danville roads, 50 miles from Richmond, whence a short distance would bring him to Danville, where the desired junction might be made. Even in this ruin of the Confederacy, when the organized revolt which he had sustained so long with the bayonets of his soldiers was crashing about his ears, he was able still to cradle himself in the illusion that it was only a campaign that had failed, that he might withdraw his troops, form a junction with Johnston, and continue the war indefinitely in another field. Whatever we may think of his judgment, it is impossible not to admire the coolness of a general who, in the midst of an irremediable disaster such as encompassed Lee on the afternoon of the 2nd of April, could write such a letter as he wrote to Jefferson Davis under date of 3 o'clock. He began it by a quiet and calm discussion of the question of Negro recruitment, promised to give his attention to the business of finding suitable officers for the black regiments, hoped the appeal Mr. Davis had made to the governors would have a good effect, and, altogether, wrote as if years of struggle and effort were before him and his chief. He then went on to narrate the story of the day's catastrophe and to give his plans for the future. He closed by apologizing for writing such a hurried letter to Your Excellency, on the ground that he was in the presence of the enemy, endeavoring to resist his advance. At nightfall all his preparations were completed. He mounted his horse, and riding out of the town dismounted at the mouth of the road leading to Amelia Courthouse, the first point of rendezvous, where he had directed supplies to be sent, and standing beside his horse, the bridle reins in his hand, he watched his troops file noiselessly by in the darkness. At 3 o'clock the town, which had been so long and so stoutly defended, was abandoned. Only a thin line of skirmishers was left in front of Park, and before daybreak he pierced the line in several places, gathering in the few pickets that were left. The town was formally surrendered to Colonel Ralph Ely at 4:30, anticipating the capitulation which someone else offered to General Wright a few minutes later. Meade reported the news to Grant, and received the order to march his army immediately upon the Appomattox by the river road. Grant, divining the intentions of Lee, dispatched an officer to Sheridan, directing him to push with all speed to the Danville road with Humphreys and Griffin and all the cavalry. Thus the flight and the pursuit began almost at the same moment. The swift-footed army of Northern Virginia was now racing for its life, and Grant, inspired with more than his habitual tenacity and energy, and thoroughly aroused to the tremendous task of ending the war at once, not only pressed his enemy in the rear, but hung upon his flank and strained every nerve to get in his front. It is characteristic of him that he did not even allow himself the pleasure of entering Richmond, which, deserted by those who had so often promised to protect it, and wrapped in flames lighted by the reckless hands of Confederate officials, surrendered to Weitzel early on the morning of the 3rd. All that day Lee pushed forward towards Amelia Courthouse. He seemed in higher spirits than usual. As one who has long been dreading bankruptcy feels a great load taken from his mind when his assignment is made, so the Virginian chief, when he drew out from the ruin and conflagration in which the Confederate dream of independent power was passing away, and marched with his men into the vernal fields and woods of his native state, was filled with a new sense of encouragement and cheer. "I have got my army safe out of its breastworks," he said, "and in order to follow me the enemy must abandon his lines, and can derive no further benefit from his railroads or James River." But he was now dealing with the man who, in Mississippi, had boldly swung loose from his base of supplies in an enemy's country, in face of an army equal to his own, and had won a victory a day without a wagon train. There was little fighting the first day except among the cavalry. Custer attacked the Confederates at Nemonazine Church, and later in the day Merritt's cavalry had a sharp contest with Fitzhugh Lee at Deep Creek. On the 4th, Sheridan, who was aware of Lee's intention to concentrate at Amelia Courthouse, brought his cavalry with great speed to Jetersville, about 8 miles southwest of the courthouse, where Lee's army was resting. Sheridan entrenched and sent tidings of his own and the enemy's position to Grant, and on the afternoon of the next day the 2nd and 6th Corps came up. A terrible disappointment awaited General Lee on his arrival at Amelia Courthouse. He had ordered, he says, supplies to be forwarded there, but when his half-starved troops arrived on the 4th of April, they found that no food had been sent to meet them, and nearly 24 hours were lost in collecting subsistence for men and horses. This delay was fatal and could not be retrieved. The whole pursuing force was south and stretching out to the west of him, when he started on the night of the 5th of April to make one more effort to reach a place of temporary safety. Burkeville, the junction of the Lynchburg and Danville roads, was in Grant's possession. The way to Danville was barred, and the supply of provisions from the south cut off. Lee was compelled to change his route to the west, and he now started for Lynchburg, which he was destined never to reach. It had been Meade's intention to attack Lee at Amelia Courthouse on the morning of the 6th of April, but before he reached that place he discovered that Lee's westward march had already begun and that the Confederates were well beyond the Union left. Meade quickly faced his army about and started in pursuit. A running fight ensued for 14 miles, the enemy, with remarkable quickness and dexterity, halting and partly entrenching themselves from time to time, and the National forces driving them out of every position, moving so swiftly that lines of battle followed closely on the skirmish line. At several points the cavalry, on this and the preceding day, harassed the moving left flank of the Confederates and worked havoc on the trains, on one occasion causing a grievous loss to history by burning Lee's headquarters baggage with all its wealth of returns and reports. Sheridan and Meade pressed so closely at last that Ewell's corps was brought to bay at Sailor's Creek, a rivulet running northward into the Appomattox. Here an important battle, or rather series of battles, took place, with fatal results to Lee's fast-vanishing army. The Fifth Corps held the extreme right and was not engaged. Humphreys, coming to where the roads divided, took the right fork and drove Gordon down towards the mouth of the creek. A sharp battle was fought about dark, which resulted in the total defeat of the Confederates, Humphreys capturing 1,700 prisoners, 13 flags, 4 guns, and a large part of the main trains, Gordon making his escape in the night to High Bridge with what was left of his command. Wright, on the left-hand road, had also a keen fight and won a most valuable victory. With Wheaton's and Seymour's divisions, he attacked Ewell's corps, in position on the banks of the creek, enveloping him with the utmost swiftness and vehemence. Sheridan, whose cavalry had intercepted the Confederates, ordered Crook and Merritt to attack on the left, which was done with such vigor, Davies's horsemen riding over the enemy's breastworks at a single rush, that, smitten in front and flank, unable either to stand or to get away, Ewell's whole force was captured on the field. The day's loss was deadly to Lee, not less than 8,000 in all, among them such famous generals as Ewell, Kershaw, G.W. Custis Lee, M.D. Corse, and others were prisoners. In the meantime Ord, under Sheridan's orders, had moved rapidly along the Lynchburg road to Rice's Station, where he found Longstreet's corps entrenched, and night came on before he could get into position to attack. General Theodore Reed, Ord's chief of staff, had gone still further forward with 80 horsemen and 500 infantry to burn High Bridge if possible. In the attempt to execute this intention he fell in the neighborhood of Farmville, with 2 divisions of Confederate cavalry under Rosser and T.T. Munford. One of the most gallant and pathetic battles of the war took place. General Reed, Colonel Francis Washburne, and all the cavalry officers with Reed were killed and the rest captured. The Confederate loss was also heavy. Reed's generous self-sacrifice halted the Confederate army for several hours. Longstreet lost the day at Rice's Station, waiting for Anderson, Ewell, and Gordon to unite with him. They were engaged in a fruitless attempt to save their trains, which resulted, as we have seen, in the almost total loss of the trains, in the capture of Ewell's entire force, and in the routing and shattering of the other commands. The day's work was of incalculable value to the national arms. Sheridan's unerring eye appreciated the full importance of it. His hasty report ended with the words, "If the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender." Grant sent the dispatch to President Lincoln, who instantly replied, "Let the thing be pressed." In fact, after nightfall on the 6th, Lee's army could only flutter like a wounded bird with one wing shattered. There was no longer any possibility of escape. Yet General Lee found it hard to relinquish the illusions of years, and his valiant heart still dreamed of evading the gathering toils and forming somewhere a junction with Johnston and indefinitely prolonging the war. As soon as night had come down on the disastrous field of Sailor's Creek, he again took up his weary march westward. Longstreet marched for Farmville, crossed to the north bank of the Appomattox, and on the 7th moved out on the road which ran through Appomattox Courthouse to Lynchburg. His famishing troops had found provisions at Farmville, and with this refreshment marched with such celerity that Grant and Sheridan, with all the energy they could breathe into their subordinates, could not head them off or bring them to decisive battle that day. Nevertheless, the advance of the Union army hung close upon the heels of the Confederates. The rear corps under Gordon had burned the railroad bridge near Farmville behind them, but General Barlow, sending his men forward at double quick, saved the wagon bridge, and the Second Corps crossed over without delay and continued the chase, Humphreys taking the northern road and sending Barlow by the railroad bed along the river. Barlow overtook Gordon's rear, working great destruction among his trains. Humphreys came up with the main body shortly after noon, and pressing them closely held them till evening, expecting Barlow to join him, and Wright and Crook to cross the river and attack from the south, a movement which the swollen water and the destruction of the bridge prevented. General Irvin Gregg's brigade had indeed succeeded in getting over, but was attacked by an overwhelming force of Confederate cavalry, 3 divisions, Gregg being captured and his brigade driven back. This trivial success in the midst of unspeakable disaster delighted General Lee. He said to his son, W.H.F. Lee, "Keep your command together and in good spirits, General. Do not let it think of surrender. I will get you out of this." But his inveterate optimism was not shared by his subordinates. A number of his principal officers, selecting General William N. Pendleton as their spokesman, made known to him on the 7th their belief that further resistance was useless, and advised surrender. General Lee replied, "I trust it has not come to that. We have yet too many bold men to think of laying down our arms." Besides, he feared that if he made the first overture for capitulation, Grant would regard it as a confession of weakness and demand unconditional surrender. But General Grant did not wish to drive a gallant antagonist to such extremes. On this same day, seeing how desperate was Lee's condition, and anxious to have an end of the now useless strife, he sent him this courteous and generous summons. The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. This letter was sent at night through Humphreys' lines to Lee, who at once answered, "Though not entertaining the opinion you express on the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender." The forlorn remnant of the Confederate army stole away in the night, on the desperate chance of finding food at Appomattox and a way of escape to Lynchburg, and at daybreak the hot pursuit was resumed by the 2nd and 6th Corps. All this day the flight and chase continued, through a portion of Virginia never as yet wasted by the passage of hostile armies. The air was sweet and pure, scented by opening buds and the breath of spring. The early peach trees were in flower. The sylvan bypaths were slightly shaded by the pale green foliage of leafing trees. Through these quiet solitudes the diminishing army of Lee plodded on, in the apathetic obedience which is all there is left to brave men when hope is gone, and behind them came the victorious legions of Grant, inspired to the forgetfulness of pain and fatigue by the stimulus of a prodigious success. Sheridan, on the extreme left, by unheard-of exertions, at last accomplished the important task of placing himself squarely on Lee's line of retreat. His advance under George A. Custer captured, about sunset on the evening of the 8th, Appomattox Station with 4 trains of provisions, then attacked the rebel force advancing from Farmville and drove it toward the courthouse, taking 25 guns and many prisoners. A reconnaissance revealed the startling fact that Lee's whole army was coming up the road. Though he had nothing but cavalry, Sheridan, with undaunted courage, resolved to hold the inestimable advantage he had gained, sending a request to Grant to hurry up the required infantry support, saying that if Gibbon and Griffin could get to him that night, they might perhaps finish the job in the morning. He added, with singular prescience, referring to the negotiations which had been opened, "I do not think Lee means to surrender until compelled to do so." This was strictly true. When Grant received Lee's first letter, he replied on the morning of the 8th, saying, "Peace being my great desire, there is but one condition I would insist upon, namely, that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified from taking up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. I will meet you, or will designate officers to meet any officers you may name for the same purpose, at any point agreeable to you, for the purpose of arranging definitely the terms upon which the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia will be received." But in the course of the day a last hope seemed to have come to Lee that he might yet reach Appomattox in safety, and thence make his way to Lynchburg. A hope utterly fallacious, for Stoneman was now on the railroad near Lynchburg. He therefore, while giving orders to his subordinates to press with the utmost energy westward, answered General Grant's letter in a tone more ingenuous than candid, reserving, while negotiations were going on, the chance of breaking away. He said, "I received at a late hour your note of today. In mine of yesterday I did not intend to propose the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, but to ask the terms of your proposition. To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army, but as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desired to know whether your proposals would lead to that end. I cannot therefore meet you with a view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, but as far as your proposal may affect the Confederate States forces under my command, and tend to the restoration of peace, I should be pleased to meet with you at 10 a.m. tomorrow, on the old stage road to Richmond between the picket lines of the two armies. Grant was not to be entrapped into a futile negotiation for the restoration of peace. He doubtless had in view the President's peremptory instructions of the 3rd of March, forbidding him to engage in any political discussion or conference, or to entertain any proposition except for the surrender of armies. He therefore answered General Lee on the morning of the 9th of April with perfect courtesy but with unmistakable frankness, saying, "I have no authority to treat on the subject of peace. The meeting proposed for 10 a.m. today could lead to no good. I will state, however, General, that I am equally anxious for peace with yourself, and the whole North entertains the same feelings. The terms upon which peace can be had are well understood. By the South laying down their arms, they will hasten that most desirable event, save thousands of human lives and hundreds of millions of property not yet destroyed. Seriously hoping that all our difficulties may be settled without the loss of another life, I subscribe myself, etc." He dispatched this letter to Lee, and then set off to the left, where Sheridan was barring Lee's last avenue of escape. It appears from General Grant's report, made 3 days after the surrender, that he had no intention on the night of the 8th of giving up the fight. He ordered Fitz Lee, supported by Gordon, in the morning, to drive the enemy from his front, wheel to the left, and cover the passage of the trains, while Longstreet should close up and hold the position. He expected to find only cavalry on the ground, and thought even his remnant of infantry could break through Sheridan's horse, while he himself was amusing Grant with platonic discussions in the rear. But he received, on arriving at the rendezvous he had suggested, not only Grant's stern refusal to enter into a political negotiation, but other intelligence which was to him the trump of doom. Ord and Griffin had made an almost incredible march of about 30 miles during the preceding day and night, and had come up at daylight to the post assigned them in support of Sheridan. And when Fitzhugh Lee and Gordon made their advance in the morning, and the National cavalry fell slowly back in obedience to their orders, there suddenly appeared before the amazed Confederates a formidable force of infantry filling the road, covering the adjacent hills and valley, and barring as with an adamantine wall the further progress of the army of the revolt. The marching of the Confederate army was over forever. The appalling tidings were instantly carried to Lee. He at once sent orders to cease hostilities, and, suddenly brought to a sense of his real situation, sent a note to Grant asking for an interview in accordance with the offer contained in Grant's letter of the 8th for the surrender of his army. Grant had created the emergency calling for such action. As Sheridan was about to charge on the huddled mass of astonished horse and foot in front of him, a flag of truce was displayed, and the war was at an end. The Army of Northern Virginia was already captured. "I've got 'em, like that," cried Sheridan, doubling up his fist, fearful of some ruse or evasion in the white flag. The Army of the Potomac on the north and east, Sheridan and Ord on the south and west, completely encircled the demoralized and crumbled army of Lee. There was not another day's fighting in them. That morning at 3 o'clock Gordon had sent word to Lee that he had fought his corps to a frazzle and could do nothing more unless heavily supported by Longstreet. Lee and his army were prisoners of war before he and Grant met at Appomattox. The meeting took place at the house of Wilmer McLean, on the edge of the village. Lee met Grant at the threshold and ushered him into a small and barely furnished parlor, where were soon assembled the leading officers of the National Army. General Lee was accompanied only by his secretary, Colonel Charles Marshall. A short conversation led up to a request from Lee for the terms on which the surrender of his army would be received. Grant briefly stated the terms which would be accorded. Lee acceded to them, and Grant wrote the following letter. In accordance with the subsistence of my letter to you of the 8th instant, I propose to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the following terms, to wit: rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate, one copy to be given to an officer designated by me, the other to be retained by such officer or officers as you may designate. The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged, and each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked and turned over to the officer appointed by me to receive them. This will not embrace the side arms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their parole and the laws in force where they may reside. General Grant says in his Memoirs that up to the moment when he put pen to paper he had not thought of a word that he should write. The terms he had verbally proposed, and which Lee had accepted, were soon put in writing, and there he might have stopped. But as he wrote, a feeling of sympathy for his gallant antagonist gradually came over him, and he added the extremely liberal terms with which his letter closed. The sight of Lee's sword, an especially fine one, suggested the paragraph allowing the officers to retain their sidearms, and he ended with a phrase which he had evidently not thought of, and for which he had no authority, which practically pardoned and amnestied every man in Lee's army, a thing he had refused to consider the day before, and which had been expressly forbidden him in President Lincoln's order on the 3rd of March. Yet so great was the joy over the crowning victory, so deep was the gratitude of the government and the people to Grant and his heroic army, that his terms were accepted as he wrote them, and his exercise of the executive prerogative of pardon entirely overlooked. It must be noticed here, however, as a few days later it led the greatest of Grant's generals into a serious error. Lee must have read the memorandum of terms with as much surprise as gratification. He said the permission for officers to retain their sidearms would have a happy effect. He then suggested and gained another important concession, that those of the cavalry and artillery who owned their own horses should be allowed to take them home to put in their crops. Lee wrote a brief reply accepting the terms. He then remarked that his army was in a starving condition, and asked Grant to provide them with subsistence and forage, to which he at once assented, and asked for how many men the rations would be wanted. Lee answered, about 25,000, and orders were at once given to issue them. The number surrendered turned out to be even larger than this. The paroles signed amounted to 28,231. If we add to this the captures at Five Forks, Petersburg, and Sailor's Creek, the thousands who deserted the failing cause at every by-road leading to their homes, and filled every wood and thicket between Richmond and Lynchburg, we can see how considerable an army Lee commanded when Grant started out gunning. Yet every Confederate writer, speaker, and singer who refers to the surrendered says, and will say forever, that Lee surrendered only 7,000 muskets. With these brief and simple formalities, one of the most momentous transactions of modern times was concluded. The news soon transpired, and the Union gunners prepared to fire a national salute. But Grant would not permit it. He forbade any rejoicing over a falling enemy, who he hoped would hereafter be an enemy no longer. The next day he rode to the Confederate lines to make a visit of farewell to General Lee. Sitting on horseback between the lines, the two heroes of the war held a friendly conversation. Lee considered the war at an end, slavery dead, and the national authority restored. Johnston must now surrender, the sooner the better. Grant urged him to make a public appeal to hasten the return of peace, but Lee, true to his ideas of subordination to a government which had ceased to exist, said he could not do this without consulting the Confederate president. They parted with courteous good wishes, and Grant, without pausing to look at the city he had taken or the enormous system of works which had so long held him at bay, intent only upon reaping the peaceful results of his colossal victory and putting an end to the waste and the burden of war, hurried away to Washington to do what he could for this practical and beneficent purpose. He had done an inestimable service to the Republic. He had won immortal honor for himself. But neither then nor at any subsequent period of his life was there any sign in his words or his bearing of the least touch of vainglory. The day after Appomattox he was as simple, modest, and unassuming a citizen as he was the day before Sumter. End of chapter 9.